From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book at the Library, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm. We're very pleased to have you here for one of our noontime talks. The Center for the Book itself was created a long time ago by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, and the general idea was to reach out to the public to promote books and reading. We were actually created in 1977 when people really weren't talking much about literacy. But the big fear was television and the technology of television. And we very quickly moved into the business of using new technologies to promote books and reading with our first project, something called Read More About It, that people my age will remember. On CBS television, when for more than a year, the star of the program came out and said, if you enjoyed the program, the Library of Congress suggests these books, go to your local library or bookstore. They'll be happy to help you read more about it. The implied message, don't go to the Library of Congress. But the positive message, we're promoting bookstores and libraries. We also are involved with some national events through the Center for the Book, the major one being the National Book Festival, which celebrated its 15th year this year. We are also administer the new Library of Congress Literacy Awards. And finally, our other claim to national fame is a network of state centers for the book that promote books, reading, literacy, and libraries in all of their states. This Books and Beyond series has started in, could it be 1996? Yes, no, 2006. Gosh, the decades just roll by. Whatever it takes to get up to the number of more than 350 of them. They are filmed, they're videotaped here for showing later on the Library of Congress website, so I ask you to please turn off all things electronic. The schedule will be, well, first of all, I want to say that the other Helena Sinkham, is not able to join us today. She was to introduce Helena Wright, but she is not here. I'm going to actually use the introduction that Helena penned for me a few minutes ago about her background, but I want to come back to the purpose of Books and Beyond. This is the book that will be discussed and presented today, and the purpose of Books and Beyond really is to show off new books that are based on extensive research, either in the Library of Congress or in other institutions, and also to highlight writers that are of special interest to the Library of Congress, often through involvement in projects or through collections that they've donated to the library. So we're proud of the connection between the Library of Congress and its collections and the production of books. And I think it's good for us to every once in a while to have that sharp edge to show what the product of all of this research is. And today's speaker has done a prodigious amount of research on this wonderful book. And Helena is using the short title I see on her screen, the Marsh Collection, the Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress. The bibliographer in me wants to read the entire title so you know what this is really about. It's the First Smithsonian Collection, the European Engravings of George Perkins Marsh, and the Role of Prints in the U.S. National Museum. Wide range and really covers a number of topics. And in addition to being a head of the Center for the Book, I'm very interested in Library of Congress history. So there's a great deal of LC history, which Helena will mention as in passing, at least, as we move through her talk. It really reflects a lot of Washington, D.C. history, too. So I was really delighted to have this, and I took some careful notes about people like George Perkins Marsh, who was on the library committee in the 19th century to advise the Librarian of Congress and really helped the library a good deal through the 19th century, but he was a man of many talents. You'll learn about him in the talk. But interestingly enough, he was one of those members of Congress in the mid-19th century that thought that maybe the Library of Congress couldn't handle being a national library and favored it at the Smithsonian Institution shortly after the Smithsonian was created. That's only a small part of the story, however. That obviously didn't happen, but Mr. Marsh is really quite a scholar for being a member of Congress, and we'll learn more about him. Helena herself has served as the curator of graphic arts at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History since 1983. She's organized many exhibitions. I'm not going to talk about her several publications. One of the exhibitions was on Audubon and the Smithsonian. For the Smithsonian libraries, she also has done research and work on collotype printing, paper making, and the history of print collecting, which led to the research that you're about to learn about and to the research about all of the writing of this wonderful book. It's my pleasure to present Helena Wright. Helena?
Thank you, John. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak here today, and I also appreciate John's assistance during my research. He introduced me to Karl Ostrowski's excellent history of the antebellum Library of Congress, and he also introduced me to Cheryl Fox in the manuscript division, excuse me, who was a helpful guide to resources there. And Helena Zinkum, Catherine Blood, and Barbara Nathanson in the Prints and Photographs Division provided wonderful and generous collegial support and encouragement as I spent many sessions there looking for the Marsh prints that remain at the library. And perhaps I should alert Mark Dimunation and Eric Fraser that Marsh's books represent the next frontier in this continuing project. To begin, I will present an overview of my book, and John has already read you the full title, so I don't need to do that, I guess. It brings together Marsh's passion as a collector, his role in the formation of the Smithsonian, and the somewhat checkered history of the collection. Then I will discuss the specific points where Marsh, the Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress intersected over the years. You will see examples of his prints throughout my talk. Marsh, a Vermont congressman and a member of the Smithsonian Board of Regents, sold his collection of European engravings to the Smithsonian in 1849, only 3 years after its founding. The Smithsonian demonstrated remarkable prescience in acquiring the collection, but displayed a good deal of uncertainty about what to do with it. To be fair, not only was it the first collection of any kind acquired by the new institution, 6 years before the castle was completed, it was also the first public print collection in the nation, and there were no models to reference what it should be or how it would function. So by 1874, most of the prints had been sent to the Library of Congress and to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Efforts to reclaim them, however, began early in the 1880s. In telling this story, I wanted to dispel the myth that the collection had been destroyed in the fire, the 1865 fire that gutted portions of the castle. And I wanted to recover Marsh's reputation as a print connoisseur in the antebellum period, when that avocation was rare. I also wanted to provide some context for the wider reception of prints that developed in the United States during the 19th century. Marsh acquired important engravings and illustrated volumes at a time when such collections were uncommon, and their presence in 2 national institutions led me to investigate their acquisition, dispersal, and continuing influence. The narrative builds in somewhat spiral fashion from a basic introduction to the man and the institutions through a detailed account of the collection and the National Museum in the 19th century. For the most part, I present this history in chronological order, based on documents and correspondence in the words of the participants wherever possible. 3 appendices reproduce the most critical documents: Marsh's 1849 sales agreement, and here are 2 examples of different versions that I found, but not the original, which we presume was in fact lost in the fire. The 1850 Smithsonian Annual Report, which describes the collection in detail and served as the basis for many later accounts, and an 1874 list of the prints that were sent to the Corcoran, which were returned in 1896. Chapter 1 provides a brief history of the Smithsonian, including James Smithson's unexpected and undefined bequest that founded the institution, Marsh's active role in its formation through his appointment to the congressional committee charged with deciding the best use for the Smithson bequest, and a preliminary description of the collection and the somewhat secretive circumstances surrounding the purchase. Chapter 2 presents a biography of Marsh, offering an account of his many interests and accomplishments. Today he's best known as the guiding spirit, the sort of guru of the environmental movement, for his influential book, Man and Nature, which was first published in 1864. But my study emphasizes his earlier artistic interests and his long-term connection to the Smithsonian. Chapter 3 places Marsh in the context of the art market of the 1840s and explores the cultural background at the time the Smithsonian acquired the collection. It introduces other antebellum collectors, 3 men in particular, who had connections to Marsh and to each other: Ithiel Town, Robert Gilmore Jr., and Francis Cawley Gray. Marsh's dealers and his specific acquisitions are discussed to provide a view of the book trade and to demonstrate his developing connoisseurship. Rather remarkably for the time, he acquired the collection entirely in the United States before his diplomatic assignments took him abroad, unlike these 3 gentlemen who began to form their collections when traveling in Europe. Chapter 4 relates the history of the collection at the Smithsonian up to the crisis of the 1865 fire and its subsequent dispersal. It provides an overview of the first quarter century of the Smithsonian's activities, with a new focus on the library, the role of the library, and the non-scientific collections. Contrary to the generally accepted image of the early Smithsonian as exclusively scientific, Marsh's prints were in place more than a year before Spencer Baird and his boxes of natural history specimens arrived, and nearly a decade before exhibition cases of those objects filled the lower main hall of the castle. Other histories of the Smithsonian have concentrated on the scientific programs which dominated the institution for most of the 19th century. To better understand the Smithsonian's evolving organization and changing priorities, I trace what happened to the Marsh collection over time. Ultimately surrounded by thousands of birds, fishes, mammals, and minerals, the collection may seem small by comparison, but every mention of it has allowed me to construct a fuller picture of the Smithsonian's history and the collection's role within the institution. Chapter 5 treats the growth of the art market after the Civil War, with particular emphasis on the reception and exhibition of prints nationwide, including the etching revival and the role of new photomechanical reproduction processes. It introduces significant collectors like James Claghorn, whose activities impacted the Smithsonian, and it addresses the growing body of literature that informed new audiences about prints. These developments influenced the Smithsonian's efforts to expand the National Museum after 1880 with the construction of what's now the Arts and Industries Building. Chapter 6 recounts the formation of the Division of Graphic Arts at the Smithsonian in 1886 and related developments at the Library of Congress in the late 1890s. It describes the Smithsonian Deposit that includes portions of the Marsh Collection along with 40,000 books sent to LC after the fire. LC's use of the collection and its subsequent print acquisitions and exhibitions are discussed in the context of the role and reception of prints in the period. It was at this time that the Smithsonian began its efforts to reclaim the Marsh Collection from the library and from the Corcoran Gallery of Art, with only mixed success. I will say everything came back from the Corcoran, but a considerable number of prints and books remain here at the library. Chapter 7 includes an account of Secretary Langley's construction of the art room in the castle, where many of the prints and books resided, and it covers the Smithsonian's acquisition of art collections in the 20th century, primarily painting and sculpture, and its designation as the first National Gallery of Art. Prints remained outside the scope of that department for the most part, and in the later history of the Marsh Collection, I addressed that paradox. Chapter 7 also treats the eventual confusion about the collection's origins, its rumored destruction in the fire, and its current location. Chapter 8 concludes the book with a discussion of the Smithsonian's role in the formation of national identity through the lens of visual culture, informed by museum studies and broader historical references. I summarize the issues surrounding the reception of print collections as they moved from private ownership into museums and libraries, reflecting on the legacy of Marsh's experience as part of this process. As many of you know, the Library of Congress initially was intended solely for the use of Congress. Only later, and somewhat grudgingly, were privileges added for cabinet officers and members of the judiciary branch. Due to the limited scope of the Congressional Library in the 1840s, when it occupied a single room in the Capitol, several legislators wanted to use the Smithsonian bequest to develop a more expansive national library. They looked to the nascent Smithsonian as a possible alternative. Both the House and Senate had separate library committees that together functioned as the Joint Committee on the Library to provide oversight on the purchase of books and the regulation of the Congressional Library. During his first term in Congress, Marsh was appointed to the House Library Committee. He voted to increase the library's budget, and he participated actively in the congressional debates over the Smithsonian bequest. In 1845, Marsh was appointed to the 7-member Select Committee of the Congress, charged with ending the years of wrangling and recommending a course of action to determine how best to implement the Smithsonian bequest. In this capacity, he was an important advocate for developing the intellectual direction of the Smithsonian during the debates that framed the new institution. In the House, Marsh worked closely with his fellow New England Whig, John Quincy Adams, to present the case for the Smithsonian to become the National Library. They advocated on behalf of the library plan, and though in the minority, they succeeded in keeping a library as part of the proposal. In April 1846, Marsh delivered an eloquent speech before the House detailing the arguments for a national library. In his remarks, he stressed that despite James Smithson's personal involvement in the sciences, the benefactor made no special provision for his eponymous institution to promote science. Marsh did not oppose the scientific orientation of other interests bearing on the formation of the Smithsonian, but he felt that a library would do more to affirm Smithson's language in the bequest, the now famous increase and diffusion of knowledge clause. Among several means to accomplish this end, he felt the simplest and most efficient would be the provision for a library, a museum, and a gallery of art. The tenor of his speech conveys the sense of intellectual values that Marsh, who was, in my opinion, the consummate humanist, had found in studying his own books and prints. As signed into law by President James K. Polk on August 10, 1846, the Smithsonian's enabling legislation provided for the establishment of a board of regents to govern the institution, a building with rooms suitable for the reception and arrangement of objects of natural history, a chemical laboratory, a library, a gallery of art, and lecture rooms. It also provided for the transfer to the institution of all objects of art and foreign and curious research, natural history, plants, geological and mineralogical specimens, namely the gatherings of the U.S. exploring expedition and other collections that were then housed at the Patent Office, and the deposit in the Smithsonian of 1 copy of all publications, books, prints, maps, and charts copyrighted under Act of Congress. Yes, for several years, the LC and the SI shared the fruits of copyright deposit. The new institution was to be supported entirely with private funds generated by Smithson's bequest. Its government appropriation and the official establishment of the U.S. National Museum would come a decade later. The Smithsonian's Board of Regents included 6 members of Congress, several of whom were active in LC oversight as well. Maryland Senator James Alfred Pierce chaired the executive committee of the Regents, and in that capacity he approved the purchase of Marsh's collection for the Smithsonian. He also chaired the Joint Congressional Committee on the Library, and as Ostrowski argues in a fine article about Pierce, his domineering leadership limited the LC's acquisitions, scope, and access in the years before the Civil War. Joseph Henry, a distinguished scientist and the first Smithsonian secretary, wanted to concentrate the institution's financial resources on scientific research and publication. And yet, rather surprisingly, Henry not only approved, but personally advanced funds for the acquisition of Marsh's prints. No doubt he considered the purchase to be politically expedient. Even so, it seems odd that the SI's first major acquisition was some 1,300 European engravings and 300 art books. Hailed as translations of the best creations of genius in painting and sculpture, the collection was viewed as a comprehensive way for the new institution to cover every department of the fine arts and satisfy the congressional mandate for a gallery. But the purchase occurred before the Smithsonian had completed its building or found its direction, and the organization didn't know quite what to do with this treasure. Marsh had to sell portions of his library to cover serious financial losses. In May 1849, he formally offered to sell the Smithsonian his prints and books for $3,000 as he prepared to take up his new post as U.S. Minister to Turkey. Acquisition of the Marsh Collection was decidedly premature. The new institution was still under construction in every sense. Funds were tight, with most expenditures going toward completing the castle, and the Marsh portion was kept very quiet until the publication of the 1850 annual report. Neither Henry nor the librarian, Charles Coffin Jewett, mentioned Marsh by name, as he had requested strict anonymity in regard to the purchase, probably to keep his creditors at bay. Jewett considered a print collection the best opportunity available to the institution because he was not very optimistic about the prospect for acquiring painting and sculpture of a similar caliber. The purchase represented a remarkable, if somewhat rudimentary, understanding within the Smithsonian of the potential role for a public art collection. As Jewett observed, engraving seems to be the only branch of the fine arts which we can, for the present, cultivate. One good picture or statue would cost more than a large collection of prints. It can hardly be doubted that in no way could this institution do so much for every department of the fine arts as by procuring a collection of engravings so full and so well chosen as that which now adorns its library. He went on to describe the collection as containing some of the best works of nearly every engraver of much celebrity, one portfolio of Dürer, another of the etchings of Rembrandt, superb portraits by Nanteuil, Villa, Edelink, and others, a portfolio of prints from the old Italian masters, and another from the old German masters. Given the uncertainty of the Smithsonian's mission in the early years, it's open to question whether the collection was purchased for its aesthetic and educational value, its political expediency, or to help Regent Marsh during his financial difficulty. Henry suggested the prints would form part of the Gallery of Art, but they never were displayed there and remained in the library. Reviewing the stages of the castle's completion and occupation, together with the few archival sources that mention the collection's movements, helped to clarify its historical role. We know it was received during the spring and summer of 1849. At that point, only the east wing and range, shown here in purple, were finished and occupied. The books and prints were put in order in a small room by themselves, near Jewett's office on the second floor of the East Range. Then, early in 1850, Jewett began to move them across to larger spaces in the newly completed West Wing and Range, circled in red, designated for the library. The move was complicated by a partial collapse of the interior flooring of the unfinished main hall, the large central portion of this plan. As a result of this accident and subsequent reconstruction, the main hall was essentially empty until 1855, when the local mechanics fair occupied the space temporarily. Legislation in 1857 established a government appropriation for the National Museum. In the summer of 1858, curator Spencer Baird began to bring over the collections from the Patent Office, an effort that continued through 1862. So the museum function of the Smithsonian began to take shape, filling the castle's main hall with scientific specimens. The Marsh Collection was not displayed there. It remained, as it had during the previous decade, in the library in the West Wing. Marsh's portfolios of prints and art volumes rested in bookcases in the Gothic-style library. Until completion of the upper main hall, the apse at the north end served as a gallery for the paintings of Indian life loaned by the artist John McStanley. This illustration, published in 1853, is one of the earliest interior views and one of the few contemporary sources that indicate visually how the Smithsonian spaces were used by the public. The genteel figures convey the tenor of Jewett's comment about those who enjoyed Marsh's collection. It had attracted much interest, not from undiscriminating idlers, but from men of taste, and particularly from artists. Henry recognized the institution's investment in the prints, and his references to the collection during the 1850s and 60s suggested it served as a marker of the cultural authority he hoped the works would bring to the institution. Invariably in annual reports, he referred to it as this valuable collection of engravings. While no catalog was ever issued, some of the prints were framed and hung in different parts of the building. The only Marsh print specifically identified as being exhibited in this way was Rembrandt's etching, Christ Healing the Sick, which an 1861 guidebook located in the West Range near the library. Selling his collection to the Smithsonian reinforced the library plan promoted by Marsh and his allies for the direction of the institution. Such a prestigious gathering of European cultural sources formed an important nucleus for the Smithsonian Library and should have argued for its continued support, although the situation changed dramatically in less than a decade. Henry dismissed the librarian Jewett in 1854, and then, after the 1865 fire, he dispersed the library, sending it with most of the Marsh collection to the Library of Congress. Many people have assumed the collection was destroyed at that time, but the west wing of the castle was undamaged. What did burn was the Gallery of Art that had moved in 1854 to the second floor of the main hall, which, as you can see, is roofless in this photo. That resulted in the loss of the paintings of Native Americans by Stanley and Charles Burt King that Henry had regarded as an ethnological gallery of much interest. While not damaged by the fire, the Marsh collection did effectively disappear into the somewhat amorphous Smithsonian Deposit at LC. Several dozen engravings that remained behind were sent to the new Corcoran Gallery of Art, where Henry served on the board, when that opened in 1874. The institutional memory of the Marsh collection did not fade completely with its dispersal. Following Henry's death in 1878, Marsh's protege, Spencer Baird, became secretary, and within a few years he initiated efforts to retrieve the collection. When the new U.S. National Museum building opened next to the castle in 1881, the graphic arts became part of Baird's classification scheme for the arts and industries, taking as its scope the development of engraving processes over time, which had been Marsh's focus for his collection 40 years before. Graphic arts exhibits were developed during the 1880s, and Sylvester Curler was hired as curator in 1886. Baird invoked the Marsh collection early in his correspondence with Curler, telling him that they expected to draw on Marsh's collection to illustrate the early history of engraving. In Baird's mind, the prints could be recalled, but unfortunately not every item could be located. The engravings sent to the Corcoran had been listed. They were identified and returned in 1896. But retrieving the larger portion of the collection from the Library of Congress resulted in only mixed success. Some items were returned in 1888 for the expanding graphic arts exhibits in the National Museum, but the reclamation efforts were severely hampered by the deaths of those men who were most involved. Baird died in 1887, Assistant Secretary George Brown Goode died in 1896, and Curler died in 1900. Even more critical for the Marsh collection and the role of graphic art within the SI, no curator was appointed to follow Curler for 20 years. Samuel Pierpont Langley became secretary on Baird's death, and he continued the attempts to recover the prints. Competition for old master prints was keen at the time, with the formation of art museums in several American cities, an active group of wealthy collectors, and rising prices in the art market. Langley wanted to report to the regents on the present condition, artistic and pecuniary value of the Marsh collection, So in 1893, he inquired at LC about the accessibility of the prints and facilities for their examination. But the library also realized their value and had become rather attached to them. Moreover, they were busy constructing a new building, and they kept putting the Smithsonian off with the excuse that they would look for the collection when they moved things out of the Capitol. In the late 1890s, Langley, as I said, created an art room in the castle where most of the returned items were kept, those that were not on exhibition. In an ironic coincidence, Marsh's collection returned to the second floor of the East Range, near the spot where it had first entered the Smithsonian 50 years before. The 1865 fire at the Smithsonian followed a serious fire here at not here in this building, but here at the library in 1851, and the construction in 1852 of fireproof rooms in the library's quarters at the Capitol. This created a circumstance which offered Joseph Henry the opportunity to find a new home for the Smithsonian's books and prints. With Ainsworth Rand Spofford's appointment as Librarian of Congress in 1864, a more expansive and truly national role became possible for the library. Eventually, it developed into the kind of institution that the proponents of the library plan, including Marsh and John Quincy Adams, had argued for the Smithsonian to be. Henry and Spofford worked together to secure passage of a law signed on 5th of April, 1866, which defined the arrangement between the two institutions. Like all relationships, this one required some attention, but its official basis in law encouraged the resolution of most problems. The Smithsonian did not surrender ownership of its library, which became known officially as the Smithsonian Deposit. There were benefits to both institutions in that the Smithsonian gained space and saved resources formerly expended on managing a library. Henry had ended the Smithsonian's role as a copyright depository in 1858. They were being absolutely inundated with material that was way out of scope for the SI. And the library received nearly 40,000 volumes that represented an invaluable scientific department without material cost. The largest portion of the deposit resulted from the exchange program of the transactions of learned societies and other scientific and technical journals received from many organizations around the world. These works continued to be received at the Smithsonian on a regular basis, so staff members at both institutions were assigned to handle the flow of additions to the deposit at the library. Through the success of the exchange program and the sole proprietorship, as it were, of the copyright deposit, the Library of Congress collections grew exponentially during Spofford's tenure. Their growth soon prompted a need for physical expansion and improved intellectual control, two issues that often came up in the library's annual reports. Overcrowding became a serious problem in the Capitol, and by 1886 plans for a separate building had been approved. At the time of the first Smithsonian inquiries about the Marsh prints, Spofford had to deal with more pressing concerns related to the building and the collections. Without documentation regarding the contents of the deposit, he had some excuse for delay. But as will be shown, there was also an ulterior motive in his muted response. The Smithsonian's attempts to restore the Marsh collection were driven by the exhibition program at the new National Museum and an ambitious agenda of participating in national expositions. To complete the historical series for the permanent Washington installation and a large temporary exhibit held in Cincinnati in 1888, Curler needed to acquire old master prints and specific reproductive engravings. He worked with Assistant Secretary Good to investigate the status and location of the Marsh collection in the hope of including items from it in his planned exhibitions. The Smithsonian did retrieve some items from the library early in 1888. These included Marsh's German album, the 2 large folio volumes of the Houghton Gallery, and 3 Dürer woodcuts. Curler entered the 3 Dürer prints and 6 other items removed from these volumes into his print accession book in 1889. As he stated that year in his annual report, I would further suggest that what is left of the Marsh collection, bought in 1849, be definitely turned over to the section of graphic arts. Unfortunately, the largest and most desirable parts of this collection, including all the fine Dürer and Rembrandts, etc., which the original inventory enumerates, have unaccountably disappeared. But there still remain several volumes of single prints, and presumably the various gallery works, belonging to it, which, if added to the present collections of the section, would considerably increase their interest. Curler also argued for the return of books from Marsh's library. He believed they offered a nucleus of great value for the section of graphic arts, which needed technical and historical works of reference. He probably retrieved Marsh's copy of Bartsch's Dictionary of Artists and Longy's treatise on engraving at this time. Other volumes returned in 1888 included a few French works on art and design. It's not clear exactly how many books or portfolios actually were returned, a point which arose in later discussions. Copies of the original sales agreement identified the books by title but did not itemize the prints within the portfolios. The collection was not accessioned or registered when it first arrived at the Smithsonian, nor when it was sent to the library, but there was some system that employed red and blue check marks, perhaps related to a lost list. It seems that by the late 1880s, the portfolios that Marsh had designated, containing works by Dürer and Rembrandt, either could not be located or had been broken up. It's possible they had been picked over, or some of their contents lost, either during their early years in the Smithsonian or in the somewhat disorderly atmosphere of the library's rooms in the Capitol. These losses could have occurred at either institution. The initial Smithsonian request to the library regarding the return of the collection was made during the preparation of the temporary exhibit for the Cincinnati Fair of 1888. 5 years later, as the institution assembled another display for the World's Columbian Exposition to be held in Chicago, further inquiries were made, but they received little response. Secretary Langley corresponded with Spofford in May 1893. Revisiting the question of the Marsh prints that remained at the library, Langley wrote, "The institution now finds itself in a position to resume their care and is considering the advisability of doing so." But he did not ask for their outright return. He recognized the difficulty of determining the specific contents of the collection beyond what had been returned in 1888. The lack of registration for the collection sent to the library, together with inconsistent formats of single prints, portfolios, and bound volumes of engravings, must have confused the process. He enclosed a list of the works delivered to your keeping in 1886, which is complete so far as is known, but which I have reason to suppose did not include many things actually sent. While the list specifies the number and general character of engravings in each portfolio, it does not, I regret to say, appear to correctly specify the number of portfolios or specify each separate engraving. This list, which I have not located, apparently was based on Marsh's original sales agreement, with additional details supplied from Jewett's 1850 report, but it must have merely reflected these earlier compilations and still did not accurately identify what actually had been sent. Langley asked Spofford to investigate the preparation of requisite facilities for examination by a suitable person, presumably that would be Curler, within the next month, but there is no indication of any response or any subsequent examination by Smithsonian personnel. So the Marsh Collection has become a contested treasure. In his 1896 report to the Board of Regents, Langley discussed the role of art and the value of the Marsh Collection. He stated that the original act creating the Smithsonian had mentioned art objects before those of natural history, yet the scientific side of the institution had outpaced its aesthetic activities. He felt the original intent by Congress was for the Smithsonian to be a curator of the national art, and that this function has never been forgotten, although often in abeyance. He asked the regents to take formal action to reclaim the engravings, etchings, and other works of art dispersed to the Corcoran and to the Library of Congress. As he stated, the transfer was made with the express understanding that they were there for deposit only and to be reclaimed by the regents at any time. Beyond the immediate need for exhibition use, other factors prompted this renewed interest. Langley understood the important role of prints in the culture, both in terms of their function as surrogates or reproductions for those still assumed to be unobtainable works of painting and sculpture, and as markers of cultural authority for the institution. There was also the question of their monetary value, and he stressed the increase in their worth since the initial purchase. Almost all of the engravings sent to the Corcoran were located and returned. Even upon Langley's official request, however, it still proved difficult for the Library of Congress to identify Marsh's prints. In theory, the Smithsonian Deposit had its own separate dedicated section within the library, but over the years those arrangements had become rather lax as the library's acquisitions outgrew available storage. While working to retrieve the Marsh collection, Langley implicitly reaffirmed the Smithsonian's ownership of all the deposit material, which remained a critical resource for the institution's research staff. For the better part of a decade, correspondence between Smithsonian secretaries and the Librarian of Congress fell into a pattern of repeated requests by the Smithsonian and a litany of excuses pleading for more time from the library. Spofford was deeply engaged in planning and constructing the library's new building, and he seems to have pacified the Smithsonian by saying they would look for the missing volumes and engravings when the collections were moved from the Capitol. However, when the splendid edifice now known as the library's Jefferson Building opened in 1897, there was a large gallery on the second floor dedicated to the display of prints. Several exhibition cases in this grand space contain prints identified as selections from the Marsh Collection. Far from being unable to identify which prints had come from Marsh, it seems the library had other plans for them. With the new building came a new agenda and a new department devoted to prints. Marsh's collection was an important component of this new endeavor for the library, which reflected the considerable interest in prints in American society at that time. Neither Spofford nor his successors were inclined to return the Marsh collection. In their view, the collection was better suited to the Library of Congress than to the National Museum. As the newly appointed librarian Herbert Putnam wrote to Langley in 1899, "In a conversation at your office some weeks ago, you mentioned to me the Marsh collection of engravings as having disappeared from view. I have had an examination made here and am inclined to believe that the Marsh collection came to the library and that it forms now part of the collection of prints. Some of the engravings now on exhibit in the print department are examples from it. We do not, however, find any record that is precise as to the contents of the collection when transferred to us. It would be a satisfaction to you, as to us, to have such a record, and later, in the course of the classification and arrangement of the print department in competent hands, such a statement could doubtless be compiled." So Putnam admits to the library's possession of the Marsh prints, but at this point they were on public display and obviously considered part of the library's collection. He seemed to be willing to make a record of them, but said nothing about restitution to the Smithsonian. Most tellingly, Putnam used the word transfer instead of the word deposit in reference to the prints, although other Smithsonian items mentioned in the same letter were identified as deposits. Putnam left no doubt about the library's position, and to reinforce it, he sent on loan a volume with 33 pieces of flags captured by American ships in 1812 as material deemed more appropriate for the National Museum. Putnam's position favored leaving the prints in the library, perhaps because he considered them to be more like books than museum objects. Prints were held in many library collections, as well as in museums. Individual collectors like Marsh and others acquired both books and prints without much concern for separation by medium or format. The practice of extra illustration was at its height at this time, and many collectors eagerly acquired prints, which they used to embellish bound volumes. Distinctions between prints and books were not clearly defined or consistently observed, as reflected in their close affinities over centuries of collecting. Another factor that contributed to the dispute over the collection was the cultural importance of prints. What one curator has called the Great Bull Market in prints extended from about 1870 all the way to the Great Depression, ending about 1930. Engravings and etchings continued to be sought after in the art market, and their acquisition represented significant achievements for institutions as well as individual collectors. George W. Vanderbilt, in his palatial North Carolina home, Biltmore, completed in 1895, displayed many prints, including Durer's multi-sheet woodcut The Triumphal Arch, now in the music room. Institutions vied with each other to capture the largest collections from the most important collectors. They exhibited their prints proudly, featuring these works almost like the trophy heads shot and mounted by big game hunters. In this environment, it's no wonder that these two institutions vied for this collection. Soon after the opening of the Jefferson Building and its print gallery, Library employee Jessie Porter Wood reported on the division of prints in the American Art Annual. Although not designated a curator, Wood obviously knew the collection well. She was hired in 1897 as an assistant in the reading room. As an artist, she may have proved herself useful to this new division. The Library of Congress first began to hire women with the opening of the new building. These appointments were considered an experiment, and in the opinion of librarian John Russell Young, open to debate. He felt that manual labor involved in handling and organizing library materials, especially as part of the move from the Capitol, was too difficult for women, for whom gentle and more useful offices were more suitable. Perhaps this gender bias actually operated to Wood's benefit by placing her in the print department, where she seems to have had an affinity. The Marsh Collection received prominent mention in her entry for the Art Annual, and this is the page illustrating it. While acknowledging that the collection belonged to the Smithsonian, the article nonetheless included an illustration that identified it as a prominent component of the library's print exhibit. Wood mistakenly assumed that Marsh had assembled the collection in Europe while serving as U.S. Minister to Italy, but he wasn't appointed to that post until 1861. She also commented, incorrectly, that many of the most valuable prints were retained by the Smithsonian. She described the collection using language that half a century later still borrowed from Jewett's annual report, but she did offer some new information about the division of individual portfolios between the library and the Smithsonian. In enumerating the jurors, she tallied 100 prints that remained at the library, including the engravings Marc Antonio copied after Durer's woodcut Life of the Virgin, which the 1850 report had described as the famous 17, in reference to the lawsuit that Durer supposedly instigated over this plagiarism. The Rembrandt Portfolio, she said, was largely picked over and the better part kept at the Smithsonian. Also, the third portfolio, containing 200 engravings by Claude Lorraine, Hollar, and Bega. That assessment does not tally with the current locations for these prints, and she did not mention Marsh's early 16th century chiaroscuro woodcuts by Ugo de Carpi and Coriolano that remain at the library. Wood's article provides some specific clues about which prints were located in each institution around 1900, but her notion of their division and distribution made it sound like the two institutions had agreed to some equitable disposition, even though such a process is not reflected in the surviving correspondence. Her description continued. The contents of a fourth portfolio were divided, and the library received a collection of engraved portraits by Nanteuil, among them a first impression of Louis XIV in armor, 8 by Edelink, and a number by Masson, Piton, Villa, Schmidt, Van Schuppen, Drevet, and others. There's also a scrapbook in which is arranged a beautiful collection of portraits of the French school in the 17th century. The fifth portfolio, reported to contain examples of old Italian engravings, was probably culled over at the Smithsonian and the better part kept, for the library has only a few, among them 2 by Marc Antonio, and some representative prints from the hand of Carracci, Salvatore Rosa, Il Perugino, Volpato, and Raphael Morgan. Added to this is a small collection of Dutch, Flemish, and English prints of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Wood concluded that the Marsh Collection illustrated the growth of engraving, and that it was splendidly supplemented by the recent acquisition of the Hubbard Collection. The Gardner Green Hubbard Collection was another bone of contention between the library and the Smithsonian. Hubbard, a founder of the Bell Telephone Company, was a wealthy philanthropist who also served as president of the National Geographic Society. Langley named Hubbard to the Smithsonian's Board of Regents in 1895, presumably in the hope of wooing him and his renowned collection of prints. Assistant Secretary Good knew Hubbard well and advised him about Japanese prints, rare books, and their shared interest in genealogy. After Hubbard died in December 1897, his widow Gertrude gave the collection to the Library of Congress, although she seems to have negotiated with both institutions. She corresponded with Curler about some of the prints, and she set certain conditions that the Smithsonian was either unable or unwilling to meet. She wanted a named gallery for perpetual exhibition of the collection, complete with her husband's bust, and this stipulation was incompatible with the National Museum's exhibition policy. In accepting the gift for the library, however, the Senate failed to approve naming the gallery for an individual. The practice was considered unsuitable and undesirable in a public building. Perhaps the Smithsonian should have tried harder to acquire Hubbard's collection if that was the main objection to the term of the gift. It's very possible, too, that Gould's untimely death in 1896 was a factor in the Hubbard's decision to donate to the library, as his loss certainly figured in the failure to restore the Marsh Collection to the Smithsonian. John Russell Young, who served as Librarian of Congress for a brief interlude between Spofford and Putnam, wrote eloquently about Hubbard's prints. The collection was described as in many respects the most instructive and valuable in the country, words that resemble Jewett's justification for the Marsh purchase. Tastes hadn't changed, and many of the same artisan prints were represented. Young's 1898 report on the library included an appendix on the Smithsonian that concerned relations between the two institutions. Langley was invited to participate, and his remarks corresponded somewhat with a contribution that Spofford made to the 1896 history of the Smithsonian. So despite the impasse over the Marsh collection, the two institutions remained in reasonably cordial professional relation. In the early years of the 20th century, several initiatives propelled the Smithsonian into the realm of art. Gifts of painting and sculpture prompted its designation as the National Gallery, and Charles Lang Freer's significant donation of Asian and American works led to the creation of the Freer Gallery of Art as a separate museum within the institution. The Smithsonian's official recognition as the National Gallery of Art, a name that was in use until 1937 when the Mellon gift created another National Gallery of Art at the east end of the mall, resulted from the terms of a bequest by Harriet Lane Johnston, a niece of President Buchanan, who stipulated that her collection of painting and sculpture be placed in a national gallery. In 1906, the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia ruled that the Smithsonian could be considered within the definition of a national gallery based on the original language of the enabling legislation, so Johnston's collection came to the institution, soon followed by the William Evans gift and several others. Washington newspapers covered the story as if to say the Smithsonian was always intended as a national gallery. Designed to cherish art, one headline read, a prime duty of the Smithsonian since its founding. Well, not exactly, as we've seen. Articles focused on the new collections, but also mentioned Marsh as a historical example. The early Marsh purchase was cited as a lucky speculation, and its location at the Congressional Library only a temporary deposit. Another article, while giving most attention to the Johnson, Evans, and Freer gifts, also mentioned Marsh's valuable etchings and engravings, noting that they resided at the Library of Congress, but expressing the idea that they would probably soon be transferred to the new National Gallery. This information may have been given to the press by the Smithsonian in the hope of finally retrieving the collection from the library, but it was not to be. Langley died in 1906, and subsequent secretaries made no sustained effort to reclaim the prints. In the end, administrative decisions made in later decades favored leaving the entire Smithsonian deposit, including Marsh's collection, at the Library of Congress. What began in the 1840s as an individual scholar's gathering for his personal enjoyment and to share with his friends became a public collection available to national audiences for more than a century and a half. As accessible objects with shared social meaning, these prints contributed to the growth of the Smithsonian in its formative years. The story of building this private collection informed the public process of institution building. The Marsh Collection was a critical element in the Smithsonian's development of cultural authority as the United States took its place as a new nation facing the old world. Traditional European works were considered necessary for international credibility, and Marsh's prints came ready-made to suit that purpose. The same impulses obtained at the Library of Congress as it expanded in a period when prints were highly valued, leading to their efforts to retain the collection. In both institutions, the presence of the Marsh Collection enriched the nation's cultural heritage. I'd like to thank my colleagues here at LC once again for their valued cooperation. I know they are just as pleased as I am to uncover the provenance of Marsh's prints and books that remain here, which we are still identifying. Digital imaging options now allow for collections to reach a wide audience online. You can see the entries that we're posting on the American History website at marshcollection.si.edu and other images here at loc.gov. Their physical locations become less important as long as they are well documented. Together, we're making up for the decades of lost information. Thank you.
have time for a few questions.
Okay, sure.
Comments from our LC colleagues on their participation. Catherine, do you want to have a comment?
We have a new batch of scans in the works, don't we?
We do.
So we have about 20 more beautiful scans that'll be in our P&P online catalog shortly. Based on your research, I mean, you're really helping us to reconstruct the collection.
Well, it's been a pleasure to work with you, I must say. And if you do want to find them, the best way is to type Marsh Collection in quotes in the Prints and Photographs search page.
Other questions?
Linda. Hi.
Helena, thank you so very much. It was fascinating. So his focus, Marsh's focus, was on the copper plates. So how is it that some woodcuts, do you have any idea, was there any indication of why he did acquire some woodcuts?
Well, he was interested in early prints. They use the term engravings as a rather encyclopedic description. He's not restricting it by medium, really.
Oh, I see.
He's including woodcut. He had quite a number of woodcuts in the collection.
Okay.
Not just the wonderful chiaroscuros that you know so much about, but the Dürer woodcuts and others. So
So he considered a
it
woodcut
was a
form
kind of a
engraving.
generic term at the time.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Do you know if he continued collecting after he went to Turkey and grew up?
Well, that was one of my early questions, and using the Marsh papers at the University of Vermont, it's pretty clear that he did not. Much of my information about the formation of the collection comes from the invoices which remain there, so we can track what he acquired, when he got it, the fact that he was using mostly booksellers in the United States, some of whom wrote abroad for him, or he would use European catalogs and mark the things off and tell them what he wanted. But it was a lot of shipment and buying a lot of unseen things that were sight unseen. He was going on the basis of reference material. So, but no, he did not seem to acquire. Primarily, I think, because his financial situation was always. I mean, he was never a very flush. He took these 2 diplomatic assignments as a way of. He thought it was a cheaper way to live. He got a pretty good stipend and could live more economically abroad, but his situation here was not very good. He lost a lot of money in the Panic of 1837 that didn't really catch up with him until the 40s, like several other people. Actually, the other 2 collectors I mentioned, Robert Gilmore and Francis Colley Gray, also lost quite a bit of money in the 1840s and were pretty shaky. Gilmore had to sell his collection, and Gray was rescued by a nephew who helped him with investments, so he was able to retain it, and his collection is now at Harvard, and there's a pretty complete collection of that. So it's interesting to compare what these individuals acquired at roughly the same time, and a rather odd coincidence that they had essentially bankruptcy problems at essentially the same time. Yes.
Where is the Marsh Collection contained in the Smithsonian, in your department?
It's in the Graphic Arts Department division of the National Museum of American History. As you may know, we were the Museum of History and Technology for many years, and we were the descendant of the early division of graphic arts that was formed in the A&I building in the 1880s. So we have the oldest print collection in the Smithsonian. It's a legacy collection of that, and it is not necessarily related to American history, although Marsh is an American congressman, and the story of what he acquired is of interest to American history, even though what he acquired was not American. So, and he was a member of the American Art Union. He did have some American prints, but they didn't come with the rest of the collection. I don't know what happened to them.
And his books are also in the Graphic Art Department, or they're in the library?
A few of the books that he sold to the Smithsonian, some of them were retrieved with that early batch in the 1880s, so some of his reference books and some of the large books that are illustrated with engravings, probably 36 or so. I'm assuming that the rest of the books he sold are in the library's collection, some probably in rare books, some in the general collection perhaps. but he did continue to collect books. He couldn't stop himself from collecting books, and they were cheaper. The art market was rising rapidly, so that was another reason he didn't replace the print collection. But he did continue to acquire books, and those were purchased from his widow, and are in the library at the University of Vermont where his papers are. But they are not necessarily on art subjects. There are a few things that published later in the 19th century on art topics, but yes.
And you say that when the Smithsonian originally acquired the Marsh or purchased the Marsh Collection, it was in portfolios and albums and a single sheet. So were the albums things that he assembled, or did he acquire albums as a item?
Well, the only one that remains intact is this early German album, and that has his hand. I can show you the image of that, perhaps, if I can get back to it. This is something that our paper conservator went over with me. He ruled around each of these prints. He wrote their Barch numbers just to the bottom left. I'm not sure if you can see that in the,
Yeah.
or I should make
Well,
that
there's
the.
something at the bottom right.
Yeah, I should make that the slideshow. Oops. Well, I'm sorry, I was trying to hit the current slide. Anyway, it's manila paper that he ruled and wrote the Barch numbers on. So he assembled those.
Them? Yeah.
But as far as the rest of them, who knows? Some of them have little numbers, little pencil numbers in his handwriting indicating an order, some of the larger prints, so that might have been their order within the portfolio, but I don't know what the portfolio itself looked like.
Interesting.
We can take 2 more questions, and then we're going to have a book signing. Anyone else want to? Yes, sir.
Has there been an effort past the World's Fair, and now that we've made peace between the library and the Smithsonian, to maybe gather some of the select pieces for an exhibition?
We haven't discussed that, but it's a great idea. I was going to do an exhibition around the publication of the book, but we're doing a lot of construction and renovation in the building, in my building, the American History Building. So there wasn't a space for it, and I was going to do one that would go to the University of Vermont gallery and one at Dartmouth, where Marsh graduated and where his portrait is, and then close at American History. But the construction schedule kept getting pushed farther and farther back, and it just didn't make any sense in terms of timing. So. But that's an interesting thought, to put some things together from both of our collections, and
We can call that a future collaborative effort that could grow out of this book.
yeah.
Again, I was so impressed when I read the book with the amount of research, and while so many subjects are covered, you really did a wonderful job in pulling out the highlights and showing, I know, the emphasis between LC and the Smithsonian, but that's also an area for future work. And we're going to have a book signing, but Helena, you did a wonderful job on the book and in the presentation, and let's show our appreciation. So books are on sale in the back, and she will be signing them, and I thank you again for
Thank you.
pulling this together and
Do I need to?
coming here.
I should probably close this.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.